a look at the newspapers now with political correspondent at the online publication Joe Ava Santina Evans and the deputy editor at Conservative Home Henry Hill. Thank you both for returning for the next stage here of the newspaper review. So, what are we kicking off with? We're kicking off with The Guardian, and Henry, you're looking at this. Let's have... Good morning. You're watching Sky News Breakfast. Welcome back. Let's have a look at the newspapers now with political correspondent at the online publication Joe Ava Santina Evans and the deputy editor at Conservative Home Henry Hill. Thank you both for returning for the next stage here of the newspaper review. So, what are we kicking off with? We're kicking off with The Guardian, and Henry, you're looking at this, and particularly a story on Israel and Gaza. What did you want to draw out on this one?
Yeah, this is one of those stories which feels like you're living through one of those moments in the history books before everything gets all kind of flaggy and arrowy. It's a sort of statement from Israel that they're already engaged on what they call a seven-front war against not just Hamas in the Gaza Strip, but also against Iranian proxies across the Middle East. The most high profile, obviously, being the Houthi rebels who have been in Yemen, who have been attacking international shipping, and we've recently seen a huge international force deployed to try and stop that. But also there have been strikes apparently coming out of Egypt. There's Hezbollah in Lebanon, there's forces in Syria and others. Now, the Israeli government says it's already hit back against 6 out of 7 of the theatres it has so far identified. But this is extremely worrying because, of course, one of the big fears about the war in Gaza is that although it didn't immediately lead to the sort of mass invasion of Israel that we saw at various points in the 20th century, there is a serious risk here that it ends up in the way that these things do, step by step, sucking more and more countries into what could potentially be a catastrophic regional conflict. And seeing this kind of talk and hearing about the scale of operations across the Middle East is a wake-up call for people, I think, that this is not just something that's happening in one city on the edge of the Mediterranean. This is a battle that is being fought across a huge swathe of some of the most volatile territory on Earth.
Certainly the case. I'll be interested to see if the rhetoric from international leaders continues to increase in terms of holding Israel to account, and whether that changes anything in the weeks and months ahead. Let's move on to the second story, Ava, and you've picked out one that's actually in a number of the newspapers, but the Times has it on the front page. Tories aiming to woo first-time buyers. What's the new tactic that they're looking to employ here?
Yeah, so first-time buyers are at a 10-year low, and they're looking at new ways now. The Conservatives to get young people onto the housing market, and this is going to be crucial coming into 2024. Housing is one of the big pinch points of the election moving ahead. So what they're going to look at is some kind of government-backed loan or longer fixed-term mortgages so that young buyers can get onto the market. So if you look over to the US, there's an option for 30 years fixed rate mortgages. Gosh, I shouldn't be a financial advisor, should I? Because I tell you what, the jargon is really quite...
Well, I butchered the intro to you guys last time. I shouldn't be a newsreader, but I am, so there we go.
But look, first-time buyers have been really struggling in the past year. They used to be able to get a 2% fixed-rate mortgage, and now they're looking at 5-6%. It's very difficult for them to get on the market, so they're having to turn to the bank of mum and dad, and that's not a possibility for a lot of young people. So the Conservatives are going to try and get some policy in that will get people onto the market.
It's interesting, that story. I didn't actually, reading it, find exactly what this policy was going to be yet. So we'll see if it is something that makes a big difference and is a dividing line between the parties before the next election. And on that note, and we talked about dividing lines last hour, Henry, your next story from the FT focuses on one area of policy that there is increasingly a dividing line, but Labour perhaps trying to make it one that works in their favour to all types of voters.
Yeah, so this is about offshore processing for asylum claims. Now, one of the reasons the government has stuck with the Rwanda scheme, despite the huge number of problems that scheme has had and still has, is that, in their view, Labour hasn't had an answer right? The Rwanda scheme is an answer to the question of what do you do about channel crossings, and as long as Labour doesn't have any policy, then the government thinks that that's still a strong point for them. So what the FT is saying is that actually Labour is in the early stages, they haven't announced a policy yet, trying to find a way to do offshore processing themselves to try and find a legally watertight alternative to the Rwanda scheme. Now, the devil will be in the detail on that. One of the things that the FT says they're looking at is simply finding a way for people to do asylum applications in their country of origin before they reach the United Kingdom. The problem with that, from an immigration control perspective, is that there is then very few ways to cap the number of people able to make claims because there's no currently legal way to cap the number of asylum claims that are made in this country, and the overwhelming majority of them are successful, so it might stop channel crossings but massively hike overall numbers. But it's nonetheless a sign that Labour are aware that despite the number of problems the government have had with the Rwanda scheme, this is potentially an area of vulnerability for them, and they're trying to close that flank ahead of the election.
Very interesting, and we'll see if that works. We'll see, of course, if the Rwanda policy takes flight in the months ahead before any election. Ava, on to a story that brings us back to the Nigel Farage debanking scandal, but with a slightly different twist to it today. What have you picked out here in the Telegraph?
So you might remember back in July, Dame Alison Rose, who was the chief executive of NatWest, she was forced to resign after the Nigel Farage Coutts banking scandal. Well, now Kemi Badenoch, who is the business secretary, has said that a review into female entrepreneurship that was first commissioned in 2018 went into practice in 2019, which was named after Dame Alison Rose. It was called the Rose Review, will have her name taken off of the headmast. So it'll still be a review into female entrepreneurship, but it'll be nothing to do with Dame Alison Rose. And look, it feels a little bit unfair. You know, she is a business powerhouse, and obviously, you know, I would like to think that the chief executive of NatWest would have some idea about how women can achieve in business. Taking her name off of the masthead just feels a little bit spiteful.
Well, it does, and you can argue all day long whether she should have lost her job or not because of the debanking scandal, but unequivocally, she was a very good CEO of NatWest, reached the top, and it's a review into breaking down barriers for women in business. So I agree, it seems like a step too far, because this doesn't really impinge on whether she was qualified to carry out that review in 2019 that had its name set back then. So it seems a step too far, perhaps. Last story, Henry, you've picked out again, picked out from another one. I think it's the front page of the Mirror as well. We've got the Express take on it on hospital parking fees, and the Lib Dems actually trying to draw attention to this, but it's definitely a story that resonates with people of all voting persuasions.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the news that the projected revenue for the NHS from car parking charges is apparently set to hit £200 million this year, 150 million roughly of that coming from patients and visitors, and then the remaining quarter of that coming from staff. Now, this has been an issue for as long as I've been covering politics, which is, as you can see, an increasingly long time now. There's always anger about the fact that this is effectively de facto charging people to use, or at least to access, the NHS to visit elderly and sick relatives, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, at a time when the NHS is increasingly struggling for funds, it is an incredibly important way for many hospital trusts to raise revenue, and it also encourages people to use public transport, because many hospital trusts have a finite amount of, all of them have a finite amount of parking, but they have limited parking. So it's a challenge, because no government can really afford to simply wave away £200 million a year of NHS funding. But on the other hand, as currently constituted, it does pose a legitimate question about equality of access. If there are people who don't have good access to public transport, or live in a rural area and are car dependent and are having to pay these regular fees to visit somebody who's in hospital for a long time, that there is an injustice in that.
Guys, we'll have to leave it there for this app, but thank you again, Henry and Ava, and we'll see you again next app for more of the newspaper discussion.